The following program is brought to you by the University of Alabama.
In his many profiles and articles for the Mobile Press Register, gathered in collections such as Back Home and Alabama Afternoons, and in his novels, Roy Hoffman makes his readers aware of the cultural diversity of the modern South, and especially Alabama. While exploring mainly the sacrifices families, especially wives and daughters, must make when America goes to war, his new novel, Come Landfall, dramatizes the interactions between generations and between Old South Protestants, Roman Catholics, Jews, and the newest Southerners, the boat people, arrived from Southeast Asia, now often shrimpers in the Gulf of Mexico. I spoke with Roy Hoffman at the annual Alabama Writers Symposium in Monroeville, Alabama. Roy, it's good to see you again.
Great to be back, Don.
We're in Monroeville this time. The last time you and I sat down and talked, you had just won the Clarence Cason Award in Tuscaloosa. And I can't remember, you won the award for narrative nonfiction.
Yes.
But at the time you had just published Chicken Dreaming Corn, the novel as well.
Well, at that time I had published a first novel years earlier called Almost Family that won the Lillian Smith Award. A story about a African-American family and a Jewish family through the civil rights period, very much based on some of my experiences. And then I had published the first collection of nonfiction called Back Home, Journeys Through Mobile, which was keyed to the fact that after living in New York City for 20 years, I moved back home and saw it through fresh eyes, and certainly felt energized to write about it in a way that I had never seen it or understood it. And then I had published a second novel, Chicken Dreaming Corn, very much inspired by my grandparents, Eastern European Jews who ended up in the Deep South and were at the heart of the mercantile world of Mobile, Alabama, meant to be emblematic of the way in which in southern towns all over there was often a little clutch of folks who were newcomers who had those downtown stores, Jews, Greeks, Lebanese, and so on, and created a little global culture in the midst of Dixie.
You know, I don't know that I have, in all the conversations we've had over the last 30 years or whatever, I don't know that I've ever asked you, as a Alabamian, Southerner, and then you were educated at Tulane, right?
Right.
Can you remember what it was like to be an expat, to go up and live in the United States? At New York, I'm speaking.
Right. It's part of the state. It's part of the U.S.
What did that feel like? Did you feel like you had moved to a different kind of place? Did you feel like an outsider? You write often about the outsiders in Alabama, but you were for a while an outsider in the North.
Right. Well, I had one very good reason I moved to New York City, and that is that after graduating from my undergraduate years at Tulane, I went to see my big sister Cheryl, the eldest of four, who was 15 years my senior. Oh. And the first trip I made to see her, and I've written an essay about this recently, it was 1963, 64, and I was 10 going on 11. Uh-huh. And Cheryl was already in her, 15 years older, was in her maybe 27 at the time, 26, 27. And she had just begun to climb the ladder in a television career, which ultimately saw her directing a daytime drama, All My Children, for years and years, and nominated for many Emmys. But along the way, she worked for Gary Moore, she worked for Carol Burnett, Jimmy Dean, worked on the David Frost Show, and her mentor was then the director of Late Night with David Letterman. Hal Gurney is his name. And then she was moving up in daytime drama and variety shows, and then moved over into soaps. So I loved my sister. She was, like so many women of her generation, she loved the Deep South, she loved home, she loved the Bay, but she really felt more alive and freer when she could be in the big city. And in those days, she would write letters home, and I've got a box of her letters. You know, she would type them to my mom and dad, saying, "We just saw a new young singer named Barbara Streisand at a club down the street," you know, or just went to see this new musical, Fiddler, or whatever it would be.
Right.
So she opened this world for me in New York. And then when I got there, Don, it became very clearly evident to me that two of the most misunderstood places in the United States then, and perhaps to some degree now, were New York City, especially to the people in the Deep South back then, you know, and the Deep South and Alabama in particular, to the people who were in New York. So I don't want to say that I felt like a man without a country, because I also entered, like so many young people do, that world of 20-somethings who were, you know, hanging out and meeting each other and having a drink and talking about the novels and the paintings and the plays and the operas and the dances, you know, that they would create that great sense of energy. But in those days, pre-smartphone, pre-internet, you know, where maybe there was one phone call a week, it was a lot farther away than it is today. So I also became interested in these new American groups that I could see when I went down to Brighton Beach and could see the new Russians who'd come in. At some point I worked in downtown New York and could, down near in the World Trade Center, and could look out and see the boats coming in from Ellis Island and thinking about my grandparents. So it's not so much that I felt alienated, because I had some family, and also as a Jew in Alabama, I was rather startled and pleased to find out that come the High Holy Days, the Italian butcher would say Happy New Year, you know, or on
in
Passover, right, you know, the Polish, you know, grocer would, you know, ready your lamb. And so, because Jewish culture was so embraced and so welcomed and so familiar, it did not feel foreign to me in that way. And then on my trips home, I comfortably assumed the sensibility and felt enveloped by the atmosphere and the texture of home as well. So I really was a person of two places and managed to merge them. But it certainly sensitized me to the fact that the Deep South is an American place too, as much as New York is an American place. It's just not always as evident on the surface that there is so much diversity and that there are so many languages and faiths and sensibilities and genealogies that are sort of coursing through
we
this
think
culture.
of New York that way, New York City, as this melting. Well, not all the pieces have melted, as this stew of all these different ethnicities. We don't think, unless we stop and think, of Alabama in the same way. But your writing over the last many years is an exploration of the varieties in Alabama. By the way, as a New Yorker who came to Alabama, I'm aware of most Alabamians. If you say you're from New York, they imagine several 100,000 square miles of pavement that extends way past Albany up into the Adirondacks.
Exactly.
And there's no telling them about the cows and the rivers. And they don't know all that's there.
Of course.
They think it's absolutely all cement canyons. Your second to most recent book is, again, in essay form, and the Alabama Afternoons, an exploration of a lot of different kinds of folks. But one of the things, this is a writers' conference, so we're interested in writers more than we are in politicians and so on. You found in South Alabama a lot of writers to interview and to do profiles of. What is Mobile and Baldwin County and Mobile County? I mean, what accounts for the richness of the writing community there? You've got a huge cadre of people just in Fairhope.
Well, Alabama Afternoons is a collection of pieces of, as I say it, Alabamians famous and obscure, some of them famous on their block. I did not set out with a premise to conclude why there are interesting people like this in Alabama or why there are writers in South Alabama and so on. I wrote the pieces for either my hometown paper or other publications, and then we culled through them and put it together.
Right.
But in doing so, I, like you, began to realize that there was sort of an uptick of the numbers of the profiles, particularly of literary and artistic people who were in that part of the state. I do know that the Gulf Coast has its own kind of sensibility, like a 51st state in a way. New Orleans, Biloxi, Mobile, Pensacola, the storms, the shipping, the presence of the water, the feeling of being ports and near places where people are coming from all over. Yeah. So sometimes people have moved to places like South Alabama. Some of the writers who are very well known in our state may have summer places or weekend places in the Fairhope area. But otherwise, if you look at some of the writers that I talked about there, Winston Groom, Mary Ward Brown is not South Alabama, but she's sort of Central Alabama. Catherine Tucker Wyndham, really not Baldwin County, but Selma is sort of, coming to this part of the state. Hal Raines, who now is in Fairhope part of the year, who's back, and I did a profile of him. Diane McWhorter, who's very much Birmingham, and yet who on visits down to that part of the state, was very much intrigued by and interested in that culture as well. What I found is that the sense of the large sort of French Catholic background, the presence of great writers like Albert Murray, who's not profiled in this book, but in my first one back home, acted as a kind of a guiding presence. Murray was born and grew up right near downtown Mobile. And Harper Lee, who's not profiled here, but is kind of a guiding presence from Monroeville, grew up reading the Mobile Register. And as a matter of fact, in To Kill a Mockingbird, there are a couple of references to the Mobile papers. So it's because it's a beautiful place, because it's a culturally rich place, because there's something about heat and summer afternoons and tropical weather, and the presence of even now a Hispanic population and an Asian American population that I think sort of seeds the imagination and acts as a kind of a driving force for people in the creative fields.
Yeah, Eugene Walter always used to talk about the port cities of the Gulf as being, in their own small way, international cities, because if for no other reason, the sailors and the food and the smells and the things that were brought in.
I'm also very good friends with John Sledge, who is an essayist, and his father wrote the memoir With the Old Breed, which was a great memoir of World War II, and John and I are like every day on the phone and lunch once a week, sort of writing buddies. And I know other writers in the area. And so I think it's good to have a small community of writers. Now, in New York City, the old saying is, you could throw a stick and hit 5 writers. Although you probably wouldn't be able to hit them because they'd be like on the couch taking a nap or, or like holed up in their apartments. And so it's not the case, in the Deep South. And the other thing is, at least in where I live, is that the writers have some stature, some status in the community. People love their literature, people are interested in reading, and still look to the writers as people who can tell them something that they may learn something from. So I think that's good as well.
And things do not stay the same. One of the things that's going on, I suppose it's utterly commonplace, but even in a place like Alabama, which sometimes appears never to change, they do change. Now, you've moved your new book, Come Landfall. It could have been a Bayou Battery book, could have been a Mobile Bay book, but you moved it over to Biloxi. Right. And reading along through that, I thought, this is a boat book. You've got it, and cheek by jowl are things there that are remarkably dissimilar. You have Jefferson Davis's retirement home.
Yes.
A kind of nursing retirement home, Vietnamese shrimp boat, and a moored up gambling boat. And there they all are, a mile from each other,
as they are in real life. Yeah.
I think that is the case. You brought in the Vietnamese dimension to this novel. You could have done it, and as I say, you could have put that part of the novel in Alabama, no trouble. These were boat people. These were Vietnamese who came at the tail end of the war in Vietnam.
Well, the Catholic refugee resettlement program brought a lot of the Southeast Asians after the fall of Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia to the Deep South to go into the fishing industries. Similar climate, some of these new Americans had fishing in their background or working in seafood processing. And the communities are now into the second and third generations. The reason that I moved the setting of my novel, which is about, I'd say it's about three women, the men they love, and the three wars that impact them. The reason I moved it to the Biloxi Gulfport area has to do with the exact kinds of cheek by jowl, those juxtapositions that you talk about. I'm very much interested in place as a writer. Yeah. And it goes from my first novel in my first collection on the way through this new novel, how we're shaped by place, how we in turn shape the places where we are through the work we do and the books we write and the conversations we have. And the other thing is that dramatically speaking, the unity of place, that it's as old as, the Greeks, exists there along the stretch of Highway 90 with this cinematic backdrop of sky, with this weather playing itself out in this high drama. And of course we've got the hurricanes, and landfall being the metaphor, not only the description of weather, but a metaphor for the storms that engulf the characters themselves emotionally. We have these casinos, which are on these sort of tricked up riverboats in many cases, with all of the New South, the garish money coming in from Texas, Louisiana, and Saturday night with the slot machines and the shows, sometimes of performers who haven't been on the main stage for years.
Everybody's got to earn a living.
Everybody's got to earn a living. And then you have these beautiful antebellum homes, and down a side street, Oak Street in Biloxi, for example, you come into this area where you've got these houses of the Vietnamese community whose shrimp boats are on Back Bay, which is not far. And Don, there is a Vietnamese Catholic church with a statue of Mary in the front, and next to it is a Vietnamese Buddhist temple with a statue of Bodhisattva Quan Am, a Bodhisattva teacher figure in Buddhism, in the front. So it's these. So for a writer, particularly somebody like me who's interested in place, this became part of the driving force of the narrative. And also, once you've been at this for a while, it's good to turn up new material, turn up new places if that's what gives you energy. Where do you find energy for yet another book? And to me, I've tromped around a lot of those landscapes I've written about in South Alabama and the Bayou and Mobile Bay and so on. Not that I won't return to it, but it excited me. And I loved going down there again and again and wandering and seeing how all this fits together.
Right. And the Vietnamese, what you did with your grandfather in Chicken Dreaming Corn, the Romanian Jewish tradition coming into Mobile, you did here with this Vietnamese family, although it's just the father and the daughter.
Right.
You have these, as you said, these three wars: World War II, the Vietnam War, and now
Iraq.
The present.
Yeah.
There were moments in your novel when I was reading along and I thought, this is going to move in the direction of an anti-war novel, a kind of a howl of protest. The weatherman, your Air Force, you have an Air Force man, enlisted man who is training for over a long period of time to be a valuable person in terms of weather prediction and study of weather. And you have your Jewish veteran from back in World War II.
Inspired by my uncle, who was a prisoner of war who never came home.
Right. And then you have, of course, the Vietnam experience. When I closed the book, I did not think that. I thought Roy has, depending on my generosity of spirit at that moment, has Roy decided he wants to have it both ways? Or in terms of an anti-war novel or not? Or has he somehow has he made his peace with Afghanistan and Iraq? Here you are. What do you think the reader, how do you think the reader comes away especially in terms of the third of the wars,
right,
or
right.
the second as well, the Vietnam War.
Right, right. I've written essentially what's a home front story.
Yes.
What I knew that I wanted to be absolutely clear is that for the ordinary folks who say goodbye to their loved ones, often from places like Alabama and Mississippi and so on, to go off to fight these wars, not always on the front lines, not always as fighter pilots, not always, as tank commanders, sometimes as weather observers, other times as, radio operators, whatever it might be. And then, because of the nature of these wars, with the improvised explosive devices, with the kinds of accidents that happened and the random and unpredictable nature of deaths, I wanted to make sure that those kinds of folks were written about, and one of the things that's always interested me, that the people who don't get ink, get ink. So an ordinary woman whose husband may or may not come home, or other people, women at the casino, and of course it can be a man whose wife or girlfriend, is brought as well. Yeah. So, there are wonderful stories about women in war situations. This came from some of my journalistic work, because we had a small staff, ever smaller as the paper moved on, and I spent some time talking to people who had lost sons and husbands and brothers in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I'll never forget talking to a woman whose son was in a helicopter, did something, he wasn't a pilot, he did something in the helicopter, they crashed and he died. And I met her in a Waffle House in Saraland, Alabama, 10 minutes outside of Mobile, and with their other son, and she was just weeping, and I wrote this piece about who he was. I never wanted to write about his patriotism or his sacrifice or his heroism, though that's often how the headlines would come out. I wanted to talk about, this was a 20-year-old young man, not long out of high school, and he had always had this interest in this particular, in flight, and he wanted to go, and he wanted to do his part, and he felt inspired by 9/11, and never came home. And we wrote the piece, and it was on the front page, and I got all kinds of responses. A week or two later, she sent me a thank you note, and she just said, soon my son's name will be gone from the news, and he'll be one of thousands of people who've lost their lives. That you have written about him and dignified him by telling his simple story means a great deal to me. So that's really part of what drove this book. It was not so much to be pro or against the war, because Angela, the young woman who kind of is at the heart of the Iraq story, it's really about how she comes to terms with it. Because the hardest thing to do is to look in the face of somebody who's lost somebody in Iraq and ask them, well, do you think it was worth it? Do you think that sacrifice counts? So to some degree, it's about my characters coming to terms with that question themselves. It is very, very complex, and I think it's probably something that changes in the course of one's life. The story of Nana, Angela's grandmother, Christiane in the novel is her name, who's thinking back in her 80s to the young flyer who never came home, has experienced him at different phases of her life. And so I think people will still be coming to terms with the dead from these contemporary wars as their own lives continue. Yeah. But what's most important is that we never forget the sacrifices they made, and always think of the value of a single life when it comes to the sorts of political decisions that are being made, and ask that question. Never forget to ask
for the next.
Is it worth the life of my son? Is it worth the life of? And so many people would have answered that in an anguished but ultimately positive way about World War II and other kinds of conflicts. Can they answer that? But I'll tell you one thing: I've never been able to ask anybody that question who's lost somebody. I could never ask a mother, well, do you think it was worth it? I mean, what have we gained? Afghanistan, look, it's a mess.
You're just not allowed to say
your
son, your husband, your father died in vain.
Of course.
You can think it if you want. But I thought placing the three wars side by side implicit was most people felt pretty good about the sacrifices that had to be made for World War II.
Right.
Much less good about the sacrifices in Vietnam, and uncertain at the present time about the Gulf Wars.
Absolutely.
You work all the time. You're retired. Well, I can't even say you're retired. Who retires? Writers don't retire. You're not a full-time journalist anymore, so you have time to write.
Right.
We have 2 minutes. What are you writing now? Where are you going next?
There are two forms that draw me a great deal. One is the personal essay, and I've written some personal essays recently. I did a series for the New York Times for their booming section from the perspective of the baby boomers. They don't have this section anymore. One about my experiences having hitchhiked when I was 19 years old, looking back on it.
Yeah.
At 59 turning 60 when I was 19 turning 20. Another about how dancing's changed over the years, because I used to love to dance with my mom and dad, my wife and I, when we were dating, and what it's like as those social forms change. And it's meant to be musical and festive, but also about being an older person. And the third about prayer, what it means as somebody who grew up Jewish and still feel very much Jewish and identify and embrace my faith. Yet what is it like to meet and to talk to people of different faiths and to hear about their faith journeys? And do I still feel I can pray? And who am I praying to? There's sorts of questions that we ask as time moves on. And the New York Times published this in February of 14 of this year. And I must say, I was very proud. It was one of the most emailed pieces that week. And I'm continue to get dozens, hundreds of emails from people, seekers, pilgrims, skeptics, insomniacs. And I'm also, I have to admit, I'm also deep into another novel that I've been working on for a good while.
Good.
And it's very much rooted in the image of a man on the Fairhope Pier throwing a net, because I see that all the time.
Right.
And going back into his life. And yet, probably, if this comes to fruition one day, and I hope it will, you will also see people of different generations. You'll see people from all over the world. You'll have a sense of what it means for people to try to connect with each other at the same time as so many things also try to pull them apart.
Yeah. Thank you, Roy. I'm looking forward to your future work.
Thanks, Don.
To order this season of Bookmark on DVD, call 1-800-463-8825. Additional information can be found on our website at www.alabamatv.org.